Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session on building performance standards, a national roundup with Lori Gilmer. Uh, Lori is the president and COO of FEA. She's been a vital part of the Best Center since its inception, part of our National Visiting Committee. She is past chair of the IFMA Global Board and an IFMA qualified instructor. She also teaches for ASHRAE and is the ASHRAE liaison for IFMA. I don't know how she does it all, but she's everywhere all the time and an amazing professional. Her topic fits well with our previous speaker. Building performance standards are being rolled out across the country in various states, including Colorado, New York, Massachusetts, and Washington State. And they represent a way of incentivizing building owners to adopt energy efficiency and so it's a very important initiative that we're seeing. And Lori's take it away.
Thank you very much, Peter. I appreciate that introduction. So I've got a few things. I'm just going to walk us through really quickly the agenda that we'll go through. We'll start off with what's the problem, and then we'll take a look at the role that building performance standards play. We'll also look at the challenges that existing buildings face. This is really where the majority of the implementation is. And then we'll look at what we can do. I spend a lot of time in the existing building space working with those who manage and operate facilities. And so as we have these policies, these really great ideas and things we want to do, it's the owners and operators that then have to make these things happen. And so building performance standards is something that they're grappling with, and they have been for a while. So starting with what's that problem, this is a graphic that I pulled from the International Energy Agency, and it looks at the totality of energy spend across the globe. And what you'll see is we've got transportation industry and buildings. Buildings play a significant role in the total energy consumption. So when we think about why do we care about buildings, one of the key reasons is they do play that significant, they have that significant footprint in the total amount of energy that we consume. And then we've got a lot of energy related emissions. So 26% of the emissions, 30% of the global energy consumption. What's also interesting to me when I look at graphics like this is that that transportation side of things, a lot of that is you and me getting to work every day, the Amazon orders that we put together, the things that we send away from our buildings and that we bring back. So when we think about buildings, we're also thinking about how do people make their way around the world and how are they interacting in business? So don't forget that as well. I know we heard some good sessions on EV yesterday and what the future of EV is looking like. So that also kind of figures into the picture of the totality of the problem that we're working on. Another interesting one is looking at the U.S. energy use. U.S. energy use for buildings is a little higher in its footprint compared to the world view. We're like 30, 38, 39. That figure, depending on who you cite and what year you look at, usually hunts between about 36 and 40%. Regardless of the specificity of the number, the important point is buildings again make up a significant portion of the energy that we use and thus the greenhouse gas emissions that we're emitting. So when we talk about where we have an ability to make an impact, buildings are that significant source. In terms of drivers, there's a few, and I would categorize them into kind of internal versus external drivers. On the internal side, we have things like, I would call them voluntary owners. Those things, if you've ever been through something like a LEED certification, or if you've talked and moved around LEED certification or Green Globes, or other types of honors, you'll see organizations for various reasons wanting to pursue those kinds of honors or certifications and whatnot. And so when they do that, they typically will have an energy reduction goal, a greenhouse gas emission goal. And so they're pursuing it for their own means. They might also have something like the cost of operations, where they're thinking, if we could be more efficient with our use of energy, our costs should go down, right? So let's do that, and we can save money and spend that money in other areas of our organizations. So let's be more and more efficient. So internal drivers. On the outside, we see things like mandates, where we have, and this is where building performance standards fit in, where we have jurisdictions who come in and say, you need to use less. We have our reasons, we have our policies, et cetera, but we are mandating that you use less. And here's what that's going to look like. And so from the outside, regardless of how we think, how we feel, what's going on with our business, we must comply with those mandates. The other interesting one that we're seeing crop up is investors. Investors, and this has been over the past, seems like it's been more popular over the last 4 to 5 years, where we've seen investors looking at businesses that they want to invest in, and those who have better environmental responsibility, they may be more interested in. So that for certain organizations can also be a driver. So in other words, there's a company, Yamaha, for example, has a company-wide goal to improve on their greenhouse gas emissions. They're trying to get to net zero by a certain date. And so when you think about their portfolio, they have facilities all over the world, and they're grappling with how to actually make that happen. Part of that driver is coming from outside investment. So, again, things to think of and keep in mind as we navigate why we do what we do. So I'm going to move us over to the role of building performance standards. Building performance standards, just for the purposes of this discussion, it's referring to policies that require facilities to meet defined performance levels. And primarily what we're talking about is energy and greenhouse gas emissions. Some building performance standards really focus on energy only. Some focus on greenhouse gas emissions. Some do a little bit of both. They require you to track and report on both. The interesting thing that I've also seen in the landscape of what we're dealing with is the driver for greenhouse gas emissions. It used to be, particularly if you think back to the 70s, we had the energy crisis, and we used to think really comfort first in buildings. Energy crisis hits, suddenly we get really excited about energy efficiency. We start tightening up our buildings. We've been on an energy efficiency pursuit for a very long time, but the language started to change a number of years ago, where we started thinking greenhouse gas emissions are really the big driver. So less energy efficiency is certainly going to lead to greenhouse gas emission reduction typically. But the bigger goal had started to become greenhouse gas emission reduction. So that tends to be at a policy level, the bigger place that we're trying to go, but those two things go hand in hand with buildings. There's another interesting thing I'd like to point out. There was a plan issued in April of 2024. It was called Decarbonizing the U.S. Economy by 2050, a national blueprint for the building sector. And it's this comprehensive plan that targets the building sector, and it's about reducing greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. It was put together or led by the DOE and championed by the Biden administration. The goals on it are pretty significant. They want to, in this plan, they lay out a way to decarbonize buildings, getting to emission reductions of 65%. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 65%. That's a big number by 2035, which is not that far away. We're at 2025 right now. So 10 years, we want to go to a 65% reduction, and then a 90% reduction by 2050. Now, sometimes you'll hear net zero by 2050. In this particular one, they're looking for a 90% overall reduction of emissions by 2050. So another kind of wide sweeping policy. And the big challenge then is, how do we get that done? How do we start working on that? Because things do not turn on a dime, especially in the world of existing buildings. So I'm going to take you back. So that's kind of where things are going and what we're looking forward to, and some of the challenges that we're facing as we move forward. I'd like to draw your attention back to some industry tools. It's if we think about Energy Star, so Energy Star, we're going to spend a couple of minutes on this one. Energy Star Portfolio Manager. Back in the 70s, we started again getting excited about energy efficiency for energy reduction reasons, and the EPA really focused on things like products, looking at, and in fact, in 1991, they rolled out something called the Green Lights Program. Some of you may remember that. And they were focused on making lighting in buildings more efficient. And then they kind of moved it up. So by 1993, we're now starting to talk about not just lights, but let's look at buildings. And so they started looking at, you usually we're thinking products, like think computers and printers, and your refrigerator might have Energy Star. If you're going to buy a new one, you might think, ooh, I need to buy that more efficient refrigerator. It is a hallmark, a brand of energy efficiency, and a good one. But many people don't know that it also applies to buildings. Anyway, so 1993, the Energy Star Building Program pilot begins. And we start looking at how do we make our buildings more efficient? How do you get started? And what they laid out was this plan for collecting information, collecting your energy consumption information, collecting characteristics about your building and its performance as well, putting that together, and then coming up with an efficiency plan. So 6 years later, by 1999, they had an Energy Star rating for office buildings. Offices were the first big target, and one of the reasons for that is that out of the many building types available, office buildings are very well represented. And so if you're trying to build a theoretical model and figure out what does efficiency look like, offices offer a really good opportunity to build that theoretical model so that those of us in live buildings can then compare ourselves to that information. So they came up with the Energy Star rating. The Energy Star rating is a 1 to 100 rating, where 100 is super amazingly good, 1 is not very good. At 75 or better, you can actually get an Energy Star for your building. So if you see that mark outside of a building, you may see on a window at the entrance of a building, that's a hallmark of that building's energy efficiency overall. So moving on, by 2000, the EPA started developing something called Energy Star Portfolio Manager. And Portfolio Manager became this great tool where you could pull together the information that told the story of your energy efficiency. It collected your billing data, so how much energy are you consuming, as well as operational data. What kind of a building do I have? Things like how many people are in it, how many computers do we have, what are our hours of operation, where in the US are we located? So that ended up being a really good tool for facility managers and operators. By 2005, they launched their first energy challenge, and that was all about getting other people to galvanize together and compete a little bit and try to be better. So initiating that competition, the thought was people they'll want to improve if there's a little bit of an incentive. So by 2010, we saw 10,000 commercial buildings that were certified. That was significant. If you look at kind of where we started at 0 and now we're at 10,000. And in 2023, they actually had 45,000 commercial buildings and industrial plants that were certified. That's not just all of the facilities that are in the system. It's those that are actually certified that have earned the Energy Star. There's many, many more than that are in the system. So that's been a huge success for Energy Star, but it also presents a backbone for what we're going to talk about next, the rollout of building performance standards. So remember that I told you that Portfolio Manager is this great tool for collecting information and marking performance. So roll into building performance standards across the US. We have something called the National Building Performance Standard Coalition, and a number of jurisdictions, whether they're states or cities, have joined onto this. And their purpose is to implement performance policies and programs. So you'll see states like Washington State and Oregon and California and New York. And then you see cities like you'll see Denver, Colorado and Boulder, Colorado. You'll see Washington, D.C., St. Louis, Missouri. Those who have decided that they want to be part of something bigger, they want to work together with others. They're going to compare notes. They're going to do their own program, but they're going to pursue this overall idea of benchmarking facilities and implementing performance measures. So you'll also see on this map that people are doing things in various ways. We have some groups that are saying, "Hey, we're going to look at emissions only." So if you look at that's the green ones. So the green dots, those are people that are really solely focused on emissions. Then there's others, the blue, that are focused solely on energy. I will point out California, this graphic, it's a current graphic, but the California is actually much further. It says under consideration, but in California actually has a much more advanced program. California did something that I thought was really smart. I live in California. I live in Northern California, and the one of the first things that California did is it said, okay, first as a measure to marking performance, first we're going to require, before we require everybody to collect their data and submit that data, what we want people to do first is we want the utility companies, so PG&E and Southern California Gas and whatnot. We want you guys to get on board with being able to upload data automatically into Portfolio Manager. So if I have a building and PG&E is my service provider, I have the ability to ask PG&E to connect to my data, get my account data, and upload that into my Portfolio Manager account. And it's not just one time, it's every month continuously. That takes a huge burden off of the facility manager. If you have one or two buildings, it's not that hard to get your data in, but you have to remember to do it every month. When you have it auto uploaded, you have a system that's kind of seamlessly working. You do have to check your operational parameters periodically in the system, but having that utility data automatically upload is a huge help, especially for those who have large portfolios. Some people have hundreds of buildings or campuses. And so having that data available and automatically uploading becomes very helpful for them in understanding their performance. But also, when we start talking about mandates, now I have to send that data to a jurisdiction. In this case, in California, California now wants us to submit our data. So starting in 2019, we began submitting data to the state. And there are certain types of buildings that were required to submit. But that made it much easier for facility managers to then get that data and then report it. They do have to submit it, so there's a bit of work there, but it greatly simplified what they do. And one of the other things I thought was good about that program is just the very requirement of making people benchmark their facilities causes them to look at their energy performance. And for some people, that's an inspiration to look at how they can improve. I work with a facility manager who has a building in Southern California, and he's always looking at his Energy Star score. He'll look at it and he'll say, "Gosh, we were 89 last year. Why are we 86? What did we do differently? What do we need to implement?" So he's using that as a very effective tool. He's kind of gamifying the system, if you will, and looking at how do I do better? What should I change? When things improve, he gets really excited. He messages it to his leadership, who are also very excited for that recognition. So moving on, I'll tell you one other story. New York City, California, and in Denver, three of the kind of standout ones that I've worked with. New York also had a progressive approach, much like California. They started with benchmarking back in 2009, so quite a while ago. It was something called Local Law 84, and they required compliance by 2019. So they got people started with just turn in your data, get set up in Portfolio Manager, start turning that data over. And they're kind of working out the kinks of reporting as they're requesting all of that information. And then they publish an annual report. So you can see who reported, who didn't. You can also see among your peers how people are doing. And that actually can also be a very effective tool for inspiring people to want to be efficient. You might want to be better than someone else's building. And they had something called Local Law 87 that they implemented, where they said, all right, we're going to require for certain buildings over a certain size, typically large buildings, we want you guys to audit your buildings, perform an energy audit, and or retro commission the building every 10 years. And what they're really pushing for is they're wanting people to take a look at their facilities, kind of take that step back, take a look at your operations and see what can you do to overall improve. Yes, you're already having to benchmark, but we want you to also start taking an active look at what you can do to continuously improve. And now they're at local law 97, where that set emission limits for buildings that were over 25,000 square foot. So they started at sort of the really big buildings, so over 100,000, and they kind of worked their way down to the smaller buildings. This is where they're at today. And they now are requiring buildings to meet energy efficiency and greenhouse gas emission reduction targets in 2024. So that we should be seeing the results of that in the coming months. They're further requiring a 40% reduction by 2030 of emissions, and then net zero by 2050. And remember, the large national plan was 2035, 65% reduction, 90% reduction by 2050. So it's kind of paralleling, not exactly the same, but you'll see very similar language in these overall goals. 2050 in building performance standard world is a big year, and you'll see sort of intermittent steps depending on the program and the plan in these. So moving on, let's talk about, so that's kind of building performance standards overall, where they're coming from, what they're doing, what they're aiming for, who's implementing them, and tools that we have. Primarily Energy Star Portfolio Manager is what they're using. But the challenge of existing buildings. So one of the things that we run into in these existing buildings is how in the world we're going to comply. It is easy enough to put a policy out. Well, there's challenges even in getting a policy together. But once we get a policy out, we've got to get people to actually get on board and comply. So for many facility managers, it's a challenge just getting started, getting their arms around their data, their information, understanding basic performance requirements. They've got things happening all day, every day. People with phone calls about it's too hot, it's too cold. Something's broken, the elevator's down, whatever. Let alone they also have to deal with something that has a long-term view, like building performance standard compliance. So just that, pulling that data together, it's not always that easy for them to get. If you live in a state like California, where you can get your utility provider to automatically provide that data, makes it a little bit easier. For some, though, they have different departments that sometimes delay the production of bills and making those bills available. So that can be a barrier that facility managers and owners face. There's also the challenges they look at improving facility performance. We've called it balancing the requirements of compliance with the desires of occupants. So compliance-wise, we want to be reporting, and in many cases, we're driving toward reduction. So we get reduction of energy use, we get reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But we've also got people in the building that want what they want. There was a gentleman, a facility manager in New York, who manages a retirement facility. Big campus, think lots of people, various buildings over this beautiful campus. And for him, as it was people age, people typically want the thermostat to be turned up just a little bit more. And so as he's trying to figure out how to run his buildings efficiently and stay within thermal comfort standards, he's got people who are wanting him to run their buildings warmer and warmer, and it costs a lot of money to do that. So he's trying to walk that fine line of keeping people comfortable, but also trying to be efficient. Typically we'd want to maybe not warm it up quite so much in the wintertime, maybe not hit 80 to 82 degrees, maybe turn it down to 75, 74 degrees. And most office buildings were even lower than that in the wintertime. So that kind of thing, plays at our ability to meet our requirements. There was another facility, one in downtown Washington, D.C., where they had it's a large, think of sort of 7 buildings all tied together. So they kind of act like one big mass, and they have giant systems. They have a big central plant that serves it. And when they had started, they were a LEED certified facility. And then after their performance period, after about a year, they kind of they went sideways in terms of their overall energy performance and use. And it turned out that a big part of the problem was they had people coming in on the weekend and coming in early, staying after hours, that wanted the building to be on and comfortable for them. So you have a very small population occupying the building at normally off periods of time in a building that was not designed to operate that way. And that costs a lot in terms of energy. So they actually, one of the measures that they did, do not do this. They started turning the lights off. So for for the security guards. The security guards were sitting in very dim lighting at some of the main entrances. Not the best thing for safety, but it is an approach for energy efficiency. It's overall not that effective. But again, it's things that people are struggling with. Budgeting for compliance related costs is another one. Figuring out how are we going to comply, and if it requires capital dollars in budgets that are already thin and challenging, how are we going to get that money into our budget so that we can implement performance improvements, whether it's low hanging fruit or whether it's capital improvements? How are we going to get that money? Because there is a cost if we don't comply. There is a cost to lack of compliance. We don't want to get fined. So trying to relate that and to message that to decision makers is another one of their challenges. Another one is the cost of energy. And you will have heard this a little bit yesterday. The cost of energy, the issue with the cost of energy that we run into kind of tends to hunt around the issue of electrification of buildings. As we think about electrification of buildings, there is the challenge of sufficient energy available on the grid, and depending on where you are in the country, what city you're in, et cetera, and what your grid potential looks like, going all electric may not be the easiest option. Either you don't have the capacity in the building or your utility might not have the capacity. That's been a challenge for some facility managers. The other thing is electricity is about 3 times more expensive than natural gas, let alone the efficiency issues and greenhouse gas emissions on grid purchased electricity aren't necessarily better than natural gas. So we talk about sometimes these big solutions like let's electrify everything. There's a little bit more of a nuanced argument that needs to be looked at. So facility managers also looking at that. At is it available? Is it going to cost more? It's certainly going to cost more to go all electric if you continue to use the same amount of energy, which is why we tend to start with let's figure out the low-hanging fruit and get more efficient first. And then there's this issue of a potentially changing landscape. And I'll tell you a quick story. I've called this the Starwood Hotels example. The same gentleman who manages the facility, the retirement facility in New York, he also managed a hotel in downtown Manhattan, and it's an old historic hotel. And he said about a little more than 10 years ago, the city, they were all on their heat was provided by district steam. So they had steam pipes running around the city of New York, and they were all pulling steam off. It was very expensive, kind of a leaky system, not so great. And so the push, there was not sufficient electricity available for everyone to just go all electric. The push was to get off district steam and to go with cogen. So they got together. They had a natural gas line installed. It was very expensive, a very big project. If you think about New York and how congested it already is, think about installing a big natural gas pipeline down the middle of a very, very busy road. That's a big project already. So anyway, a number of hotels and businesses got on board with this, and they started taking natural gas. It was a lot less expensive for them compared to the district steam option. Cogen ended up being a really good thing. They got some rebates for it. So they had some really significant wins. So fast forward to today, where there's now a push to electrify. There's a moratorium on natural gas in parts of the city and parts of the state where they're saying, we really don't want people to put in natural gas. So 10 plus years ago, it's a great thing, put in that big pipeline, spend a lot of money, get a cogen plant, get some rebates. And now we're saying, actually, we want to go to electricity. Let's get on that board. And so this gentleman said, I think they're really going to rethink that plan. And the city of New York actually has come backed off and said, actually, cogen, let's make some allowances for cogen. So there are things like that happen. So sometimes we have these really great ideas, good intentions, but they have consequences that we haven't totally thought through or may pop up when we go through the implementation. And that's an ongoing conversation. So, another thing we see as a challenge. The other challenge is the cost of natural gas being low. It's in New York. And for this hotel, the cost of natural gas is low and it's available. Electricity, again, 3 times more expensive and less available. So they're struggling with that and trying to figure out how they navigate this plan and go forward. So So as we implement these various policies, again, just we're watching for the changing landscape of what was maybe acceptable 10 years ago, what was encouraged, what was pushed, what was desired by policy maybe. And now we've got a changing policy that says we want to change it a little bit. So being part of that conversation becomes a really important part that the those who manage and operate buildings need to play. They need to represent as decisions are being made. So moving on, I'm going to cover a few things like how do we improve building performance, and I'm going to tell you it in the picture of a few myths. The first myth being, and yes, that is the Loch Ness monster. Myths tend to be those things that they keep us from moving forward, and there's those narratives that we have in our heads that maybe aren't quite true, and they hold us back in our decision making. Myth number one is old buildings. Old buildings, they can't or won't perform as well as new buildings. So we need new buildings. Well, it turns out that's actually not true. Old buildings can perform very, very well, especially buildings built before the 40s. They tended to rely on more natural means of conditioning and lighting. Um, it's our later buildings sometimes that we really struggle with. We actually have an example from Energy Star. Energy Star, if you look at their data, what you'll see is across all quartiles of performance. So the 1 to 25, the 26 to 50, the 51 to 74, and the 75 or better quartiles, you'll see that new and old buildings are equally represented across those quartiles. We had an example of an 1820s historic building, a pretty old building that's working on 200 plus years old, and it had an Energy Star rating of 81 on a 1 to 100 scale. That's really good. It's 75 or better. That could be an Energy Star building. So that was very, very positive. So one thing to remember again is just because it's old doesn't mean it can't perform well, and just because it's new doesn't mean it will perform well. Myth number two is about technology. We think sometimes that new technology is going to be better. I hear this one a lot in facilities. It's the myth of if we just had a new building automation system, if we could get that new piece of equipment, if we could get, we have a horrible example of a boiler system that was put in. We've called it sort of the Ronco example of boilers, where there was a promise that this boiler could sort of operate itself, and it ended up blowing up. Not a good thing. But new equipment is part of the solution. It can be part of the solution, but new technology does not necessarily guarantee better performance. There is no substitute for a team that knows how to run a building, run a system, who can troubleshoot, and who understands the priorities of the organization and the people in that organization. Myth number three is new systems are more efficient. So think like that boiler, that chiller, that air source heat pump. We do have better and better efficiencies coming out with newer equipment, and that's wonderful. And those pieces of equipment have a part to play, but they have to be run as systems. It still is going to come down. You could have a lovely fancy new chiller, but if you do not run it well, if you don't run your building well, you will not get the performance out of those systems. So how you run that building is keenly important. And then our last myth is on training and workforce development. And this is probably nearest and dearest to my heart. We have a lot of work to do in this arena. Training and workforce development are expensive and not that effective. That is the myth. It is also one of the first things cut from facilities budgets. It's seen as sometimes a little more less necessary and a little more optional. The problem is when we don't have a trained workforce, or if we don't continuously train our workforce and keep them engaged, learning, growing, et cetera, we really impair our building's ability to be operated well. Training is going to hit on things like safety, a must. We usually are pretty good about getting the safety training done. We deal with equipment operation, equipments and systems care, troubleshooting techniques. I spoke to a facility owner a few days ago who was lamenting that he had a facilities staff person who couldn't do basic troubleshooting. And this was the one person in the building whose job it was to do that. He couldn't read a set point, didn't know how to walk down a hot call, cold call, what the problem might be. And so they were spending a lot of money trying to figure out how to even troubleshoot a building. That is not effective. Training and workforce development are going to be key. In training, we're looking for the wins of improved performance. So things like less downtime, better efficiency in our buildings and our systems, looking at facilities that are comfortable, facilities that are safe. We're looking for increased productivity, people in the buildings that are not complaining about their environment and can focus on what they need to are going to be more productive for the organization, and then better engagement overall. So as we wrap this up, we'll have questions in just a minute. I have just a few conclusions to offer. The adoption and the implementation of building performance standards, that's spreading. Peter mentioned that at the very beginning. We have a number of places around the country that have adopted standards. Many have been in place for several years, and we see that not going away, but really getting bigger. Energy Star Portfolio Manager, it is a free tool, and it plays a really important role in these programs. It's typically the backbone. It's the means by which people are collecting data and then pushing the button to report that data to those who are requiring reporting. And then a good O&M program, that's key to improving importance. I cannot estimate that strongly enough. That O&M program, getting that training together, having people who understand how to operate and maintain equipment and systems is going to be 10 times better than any super fancy chiller that you decide to put in. The last thing I want to leave you with is this. What we're doing is important. Talking about policies and ideas and kind of this direction that we're going in to improve the resources, the use of resources under our care is really, really important. And it's going to take all of us working together to get to these bigger goals that are dreamed about and set forward in these building performance standards. Thank you. I'll open it up to questions.
So Lori, as the questions come in, I wanted to ask you a question about the relationship between energy efficiency and high performance operation and occupant comfort. Is there a relationship that we can assert, or what does that relationship look like? Because I know in the old days, maybe in the 90s, people turned off the air conditioning and opened windows, and it was very uncomfortable. And or they sealed the building up and reduced the airflow. I'm hypothetically. Where are we in that balance between energy efficiency and occupant comfort and productivity? And how does building performance standards play into that?
Sure. The 90s were not that long ago, Peter. I feel like was it really long ago? The old days is like 1930 something before I have a memory. But you're right. We did start sealing up our buildings, and in the what was behind sealing up the buildings was if we make them tighter, we're really in buildings, we're trying to keep the inside in and the outside out. And we've learned in health and wellness studies that we need to have a little bit better exchange there. As we talk about high performance buildings, we're looking not just for energy efficiency, we're definitely looking for that. We're looking for lower emissions as compared to pure facilities. But we're also looking for facilities that are well performing for the occupants in them. So we're looking for better thermal comfort. We're looking for improved ventilation. We're looking for improved filtration, good lighting. When we say comfortable, there is an ASHRAE definition. ASHRAE Standard 55 addresses what is thermally comfortable, and it's really a percentage comfort game. If 80% of the occupants register comfort, we're good to go. You were always going to be chasing thermal comfort. I don't think I've met a single facility manager who's ever fully nailed that. But there's that issue of trying to balance resource use with human comfort. As we get better at managing our buildings and also interacting with those in our buildings, and helping them to understand things like why the set point is what the set point is, or why we don't open windows on a muggy day. that is helpful to that overall conversation about expectations of the buildings. But we also need to provide environments that are healthy and appropriate for the people that are occupying those facilities. Kind of going around.
So I think we have time for one last question before the break. And Larry Chang asks, um, what is the timeline for California BPS implementation? Will there be any outreach to building owners and the public for input or feedback?
California is already reporting. If you look at the data, you can look for, I think it's 6 years of data. We have to report by midsummer. So if you have a facility, I actually ran into one last year a facility manager who didn't know they were required to report their data. But that's been required for a few years now. The state's been a little bit generous in helping people kind of get on board. So if you didn't realize you had a requirement, I've not seen the penalties implemented quite yet. I've also not seen what I don't know is whether or not there will be an ability to register comments on an already existing program where we're submitting benchmarking data and or performance data. But where it regards something like a reduction goal and can you lobby in on the standard? I think we're past that. And you'd be more in the compliance and advocacy position, looking at how do we comply, and if I have a complaint, who do I talk to? The California Energy Commission would be the place to go for frequently asked questions, and if you want to register any feedback or challenges, that would be a good place to go. But as far as the requirements for reporting, that ship has sort of sailed for us. It's not an option to not report or think about whether or not you agree with the requirement.
Right. Do you think that this whole BPS movement will gain traction with other states and cities?
I do. There's certain areas of the country that tend to be more progressive with these kinds of things. California was was the first to implement its own energy code. So we've been really forward thinking there. What we tend to see is the coastal areas tend to be very progressive. It's the middle of the country, usually where energy is less expensive, that we don't see as much of a push. I do think we'll start seeing, as we continue to think about, especially if we can get everybody on the bandwagon of responsible use of resources. Building performance standards have a really good role to play in encouraging efficiency and wise use of those resources. Getting people on board with that will be the challenge, but I don't see that slacking off. I think it's going to grow. Whether or not we get 100% participation across the United States, that's a question that I don't think we can answer. But I think it will grow and improve, especially if we see some wins in these areas where compliance is required. I think if we can see better run buildings, improved performance, improved health in facilities, I think those are the stories that are going to get others on board.
Well, I think that's all the time we have. We have some interesting commentary about the quality of data from the utilities and that it is error prone. And you can read those comments. And thank you so much, Lori, for this presentation. And we're going to go to break and come back in just a minute or so.
Very good. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.